But as Rajiv said, the paramount thing is purpose. So the purpose of this roundtable or this discussion is pathways to stewardship. That is, should we do it voluntarily? Should we do it mandatorily? That's the substance of the debate. We have a wonderful panel, which is also very diverse. We have an asset manager in Renee, we have an asset owner in Dennis, and we have a regulator in Michael. So we can have three different perspectives on the laundry list of issues that I have here. But since the topic is mandatory versus voluntary, let's just jump straight in. And if you could each, from your own perspectives, give us the pros and cons for mandatory approach to stewardship versus voluntary approach to stewardship. Renee, can I start with you?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Maybe to start with, Aberdeen is also a signatory of the Net Zero Initiative. We have committed as a firm also to reduce our carbon footprint in portfolios by 2030 by 50%. And I stress this because to do that is incredibly complicated, because you need to have actually infrastructure in place, you need to have processes, a clear understanding across the organization. What do you want to stand for? How do you measure and how you track it? And I highlight this because if it were mandatory, people will try to make shortcuts, and we have heard this earlier around ticking the box, right? And I just want to share with you a very practical example. So at Aberdeen, we do this since over 30 years around ESG, and yet even today, there are things we need to do better, where we can report better, communicate better. But when we go today to some of our clients, asset owners, and recommend some solutions that are ESG advanced, and we do high level of engagement with our companies, this quick question is, well, is it MSCI compliant? And the question is, why is it MSCI compliant? Well, because that is probably the common denominator across an industry where regulators may be lean towards so that we're compliant. So the dialogue is not around, so what are you really doing in your solution and how do you achieve the goal? It's around the fear of that it becomes mandatory, and let's first do the tick exercise. So our thinking is probably the approach of voluntary is the right one, because different firms and different asset managers are at different stages. But, and I think that's to Rajiv's point, stewardship leadership is, I believe, not only required, it can also be a differentiator for asset managers and for their clients.
Thank you, Renee. And Michael, from a regulator's point of view, we might have a slightly different perspective.
Well,
what do you think?
I thought I would be cheeky and not answer the question directly, because I think it is a false dilemma to say that there is but a mandatory way or a voluntary way. And instead of asking this question, I thought the question should be, how do you encourage adoption, which is the end goal that we want? Asset managers, asset owners exercising stewardship and adopting the best practices. And we'll take a look at what is the state of play in the market right now. You have different investors with different investment models, strategies, invested in different businesses who would require different levels of attention. And it is, I think, in this context where a code which allows for individual asset managers and asset owners to tailor their adoption is most appropriate. And that's the ingenuity of a code. It allows for flexibility in adoption while setting out the aspirational best practices that all of us can aspire towards. But I think it's also noteworthy to say that it's not just a code that we have in the Singapore system, but an entire ecosystem. The MES has, Abigail has shared that the MES has an environmental risk management guidelines, which sets out clear regulatory expectations on asset managers managing their environmental risks by exercising their stewardship responsibilities. We have, in the most recent iteration of the Stewardship Code in Singapore, emphasized the importance of the board of directors and senior managers and asset managers playing a critical role in ensuring that stewardship activities are well governed. We have Stewardship Asia Center, which is the community of practitioners who can share best practices within the community. And lastly, we have the market at large. You've also heard that in the latest iteration of the Stewardship Code, we've asked asset managers to demonstrate stewardship outcomes by submitting a report to the market at large, to their beneficiaries. And it is through this disclosure and transparency that the market and beneficiaries are able to exercise oversight over the performance by asset managers. So I think it's really in this ecosystem where we have designed to encourage stronger compliance and adoption of stewardship principles. If I could also wanted to maybe also address a point, which is what is the interest of Singapore Exchange regulation in this affair? We do not regulate asset managers, or we do not regulate asset owners. Why are we interested in this? Because we are interested in the end outcome, which is better governance in companies, better performance of companies, and regulation in itself is not a sufficient tool for us to deploy in order to encourage such better performances in our companies. It is with the market at large, investors, equity analysts, other commentators, who are able to provide that perspective and encouragement to individual companies by exercising their stewardship responsibilities, that we are able to arrive at the end outcome of a better market.
Thank you. Dennis, from your perspective as an asset owner, what would you prefer to see? Would you prefer to see a more mandatory approach, or are you happy with a voluntary approach?
I think based on the two approaches that's been talked about, mandatory versus voluntary, I think there's also another third approach, right?
Yep.
Comply or explain.
Yes,
right?
why has that not been?
That's right, yeah. So in this whole continuum, we have different models out there. From my perspective, I think whichever model, whichever approach, there will be its corresponding pros and cons. And if I look around in this room, the different industries that's being represented here, I think in our country, a lot of things are actually very well regulated. And sectors, for example, like healthcare, financial services, extremely well regulated, and rightly so. But the topic for this afternoon is on stewardship. Do we really want to regulate stewardship? Not sure, right? Something for us to ponder over. But my point is that I think each option, there will be its corresponding pros and cons. From my personal perspective, I think there's an opportunity for us to do this right. And when we talk about stewardship, such an important topic as such, it needs to come from the heart. It can't just be the letter. It's got to be the spirit at the same time. So I think that is really, really important. So an industry-led approach, whereby it's inclusive, hearing voices from everyone, and having peer competition at the same time. I think that will really spur everyone towards doing this in the right way. So that will be my preference. In the voluntary approach, right, not mandated, but maybe my final word for the voluntary part, to me, there's also two different parts of it. Is it a passive kind of voluntary, or is it proactive voluntary? Passive meaning to say, we can say the tone as it is voluntary. Companies is voluntary. Or do we say, companies, industry, it is voluntary, but we really want you to get on this bandwagon, so on and so forth. So there's a little bit more of a different tone in getting the response of these volunteers coming forward.
Thank you. I'm glad you made this distinction between active voluntary and passive voluntary. I think the challenge is how do you get people from being passive to active? And here I think, the essential question about voluntary is if it's voluntary, how do you encourage companies to sign up? I mean, is peer pressure enough? Does it actually work? What have you found in your experience? Maybe I can start with Michael on this.
All right. Well, I think I've mentioned about the entire ecosystem and how I believe that it is really through the different levers in the system that we're able to get better adoption of these best practices. So again, I don't believe that there is a mandatory or voluntary as a dichotomy, that even in aspects of voluntary, there are more active ways to adopt some of these practices. But I think what the SSP 2.0 does is to precisely encourage that by asking asset managers to report on their activities. And it's really through this that the public at large, that beneficiaries are able to then prompt them to do more.
Okay. Very good. Any other perspectives on that?
maybe I feel as an asset management firm and actually even asset owners, I think we can probably do more in educating investors and on all levels, whether it's institutional or retail, how powerful actually the money guided into the right purposes can be. And I think we need to do a better job in just showing these outcomes. And I want to share with you just a little personal note. Some of you may know I spent 30 years at UBS, the last 6 years as CEO of asset management, and I took 2 years a break. And I went and looked at a lot of startups, Silicon Valley here in the region, just to figure out for myself personally, where can I have the biggest impact? And I saw some amazing tech companies, startups and the likes, but I've realized the single biggest power is actually if you manage to channel bigger amounts of money to the right causes, because money steers much more behavior. And so for me personally, it was sort of like the light that went up before I joined Aberdeen, channeling and explaining to our investors what they can do with the money, and likewise, obviously, holding then the companies that we invest into accountable for all the discussions we had in the previous panels. But I think all of us here have such an incredible power by steering the money to the right causes, and that goes back to Rajiv's point of like stewardship leadership that we all can achieve together.
Right. Very good. I want to go back to some things mentioned in the previous panels. One is the returns on ESG investing. I think there was a slide up which showed that they are superior to returns on other non-ESG investing. I think that is probably true, although it depends on the time horizon that you're looking at. If you look at the last year, it's not true. I think you have fossil fuels have been a fantastic investment. I think the biggest coal producer in the world, Peabody Energy, has gone up almost 800%. In 1 year. And so the economies change, markets change, priorities change. Yesterday you had, I think, the head of the EPA in the United States, Mr. Michael Regan, say that yes, we believe in ESG, of course, but we also believe in fossil fuels, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time, which is an interesting thing. So the priorities have changed, given that the economy has changed, and what is affecting people, what is affecting consumers, has also changed. So in the face of this, how do you encourage the take-up for ESG investing in the face of this more complex reality? So I don't know, who would like to take a shot at that?
I think from my perspective, the train has really left the station. Right? I think the world, the trend, the consumer demand about having that lens of ESG is important. So I think going forward, it's important for management, for companies to really embrace that. I'll be the first one, I'll put my hand up, right? How much of ESG discussions happen for me as an individual or at home 10 years ago? Probably not much. 5 years ago, a lot more. Now, it's even more intense. For me, it's even more intense because my daughter will be graduating next month, and she majors in environmental studies. So you can imagine the kind of intense discussions at home. But that aside, it shows you this new generation of people and the consumer thinking, right? So I think that's why, to me, the train has left the station. We have to really look at it with the ESG lens. So I think, will the performance vary? Will it be a mixed performance? My answer, my feel is yes, meaning to say ESG-focused companies, will there be hits and misses over time? Perhaps there might be, but equally for non-ESG-focused companies, there equally might be hits and misses over time as well. But the argument now is, from a risk management perspective, when we evaluate companies, we look at prospects of them performing. We also need to risk manage, to have that ESG lens to understand whether are they poised to manage the ESG risk as a business.
Right. So as an asset owner, you're willing to forego short-term returns in years where non-ESG investing does very well. You're okay with that?
I think it's going to be a focus for the long haul, for the long term. Okay. And in the sector, in the industry that I come from, for life insurance, it is a very long-term business. So my answer is yes, focus on the long term to make the right decisions.
Right. And Renee, you are pulling the trigger on making an investment. So what do you do in a year like this when you have fossil fuels, stocks going ballistic?
A lot of explaining. And that's the honest answer. It's incredible the amount of questions you get. And just to share with you, as a UK-based company, you have that's even closer to Ukraine, right? There is even more questions coming out of Europe around the whole topic. And I think the short-term versus long-term is a very, very interesting one. Just to cite you an example, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 16 is around peace and justice and law and the likes. Because of the conflict in the Ukraine and the fighting there, the question seriously comes up, should defense weapon and the weapon industry be again something that fits into sustainable portfolios or not, right? And it is a fair question, but the point I'm trying to make, being on the right side all the time of this trade over the long run is important. Short term is probably noise, right? And so as a firm, we firmly believe ESG creates value over the long term. If we have these blips, we need to explain it. We need to have principles in place as an organization, a logic and a process in place, and then stick to it. And I want to just highlight one point to Dennis's point. Dennis and I met actually a few weeks back for lunch, and I asked him, what are your clients doing in context of ESG? Are they actually interested in it? And your answer to me was, the younger people, hell yes, they are definitely engaged in it, but the older generation takes a bit more to explain.
Right. And your explanations, have they been accepted by your investors? By and large,
I mean, there is a lot of defense you have to do and explain it, but I think if you can demonstrate, and this goes back to my initial comment, you need to have ways to explain what you do, why you do it, how you think it has impact, and that's what we as an asset management industry still can do much better.
Okay, very good. Just to go on how far you go in investigating ESG, sorry. What am I saying? Sorry, it's been so much in the news. How far do you go in investigating ESG? How far down the supply chain should you go? Maybe I can ask Michael this as a regulator. There's some companies who go one step down the supply chain to investigate their immediate supplier, but then that supplier has suppliers, and those suppliers also have suppliers. I know there are some companies that go down multiple levels to investigate the ESG practices of suppliers, etc. So how far should you go? And this also refers to the source of funds. So recently it was reported, for example, that I think a lot of the funds that came into asset managers such as BlackRock were routed through shell companies and various banks, and eventually was traced back to Roman Abramovich, who's a Russian oligarch who's being sanctioned. So how far should a company go in investigating the source of investment, as well as how far down the supply chain? So, Michael, what do you think?
So I think speaking from the perspective of a market operator,
right,
what we are concerned about is having information that investors are able to make decisions on, and that for now means that these information are matters that would affect the company's performance. So looking at it from this perspective, I think there's a practical aspect to it, which is how much control does a company have down the entire supply chain, right? Within its immediate supply chain, I think obviously there's some control in terms of choice, in terms of ability to influence. Beyond that, really depends on the size of this particular company and whether or not it has the cachet to be able to also influence down that supply chain. I think that in the ideal world, if everyone is managing their immediate supply chain, that's all you need to do, because your suppliers will be managing theirs and so on and so forth, right? But I think in the interim, before we get to that ideal state, it is really down to whether or not, as a company, I have control and influence over the various layers.
Right. Any other panelists would like to add to how far you should go?
Yeah, I think I like it that this afternoon we heard a lot about values, principles. We talked about purpose that we heard in the earlier sessions. And I think those are important elements for companies to start thinking about those. And therefore, I find it hard to say that if a company believes in all of that and in stewardship, then we have a practice that only will we look at certain kind of partners or certain vendors, or maybe the bigger ones, the more strategic ones, and then for the smaller ones, we don't quite care about that. So I think it's got to be quite a holistic approach that should be for the long term. Therefore, then the question is, how do we operationalize that, right? So based on the limited resources and all that we have, how can we potentially phase that out? So not necessarily just about source of funds and all that, but for example, the practices, the business continuity of these companies, these vendors, these suppliers, how much of ESG is within their practices. I think that's something that if the company is really passionate about that, we therefore need to embrace that holistically. Then it's just a matter of how do you map it out to make sure that you can potentially operationalize that over time.
I would make one point here around active versus passive management, because I do believe when you want to take ESG really serious, you need to go into the value chain of companies and what are the suppliers and where do they operate across. And I certainly can say for us as Aberdeen here in the region, we have a tremendous amount of engagement with the companies, particularly around these topics, that we truly understand what we're investing in, where are the value chains coming. And I do believe that is a bit the risk of too many regulations where people, as I highlighted earlier, to the tick box, and there are some index providers who help you to do that. That gives you the basic layer information. But I think if you really want to understand and be truly, focusing on that, you need to be active in this process.
Right. Since you mentioned passive investors, I mean, they have a lot of money in the markets, and very often they do not take board seats. They're not activist in their approach. So what do you do? I mean, since they control quite a lot of equity, I mean, how do you get companies to change when there's this category of investors there? I mean, how do you deal with that?
I think as a general rule in the market, there is a lot of efforts to get more market data, more transparency, right? And you have data providers who work very diligently on this, and I think that helps partially to also make passive investments a bit more transparent. But certainly, particularly here in the region in Asia, I think the data is not as easily available as it is in other markets, and hence I make the point, I think if you really, really want to look under the hood and really be ESG friendly, you probably need to be active. But at the other side, we as active investors also encourage the companies we work in to disclose more data. And I think that's back to stewardship. The more companies release, the more they're transparent around what they're doing, how they do it, the more we can institutionalize it again for the larger benefit of investors.
Right. Okay. So, Dennis, I wonder at Prudential, who decides what is a sound and sustainable investment? Do you have objective measures or universal norms that you follow? How do you approach this question?
So absolutely. I mean, responsible investment is such a big topic and important topic for us, not just here in Singapore, but globally. So within a large MNC like ours, it's really having all the stakeholders and all the different operating units aligned. So starting literally from our head office, from the London board, the senior management, and in terms of the responsible investment policy that guides all of us. And at the operating level, be it regionally or local business units, all of that dovetails very, very clearly into the whole big picture. And I think for us, uniquely also is the perspective of looking at it from two angles, because we are both an asset owner as well as an asset manager, right? Asset owner from the life insurance company point of view, but at the same time, we have our sister company, which is eSpring, so doing all the investment management. So that is closely intertwined based on the responsible investment policy that guides us globally. So I think that the day-to-day interaction between us on the life operation side versus our partners on the investment management side, I've never seen, this is even closer nowadays compared to the past. So I think that whole framework really gels everyone working closely together.
Right. Thanks. And Michael, from a regulator's point of view, I mean, how do you decide what is a sustainable investment? What company is worth listing and what company is not worth listing? Who would you admit? Who would you not admit? Is there some criteria where you follow, some formula, rules, whatever?
Right. So firstly, in looking at sustainability, or like I said, main focus is making sure that investors have sufficient information to make investment decisions. And that is really the role of a regulator in a disclosure-based regime like ours, which is to have the disclosure in the market for individual investors to make the decisions. As to, I think, what counts as a sustainable or not, at least in the bond space, I think there is a clear market consensus on what sort of disclosure needs to be put out and what sort of reporting, what sort of projects would count as sustainable. And there are consensus on what are these reporting standards to be applied for that. And in this respect, I think in looking at bond listings, for example, that's definitely something that we are looking at to set a minimum standards based on market consensus on what constitutes sustainable investments. Vis-a-vis, I think, equity investments, really, I think one of the first challenges we have is information and data, and making sure that companies are disclosing sufficiently so that investors can make that decision. And that is our, I think, primary objective now in looking at reporting, and looking at reporting standards, and rolling out a data platform that investors or companies can use. Yep.
Renee, any thoughts? How do you, as a asset manager, how do you look?
So we have established a so-called central sustainability group. We have established in-house ESG scores, where we use different data providers plus the engagement findings that we make, and we score then every single investment based on the internal house scores, and then construct portfolios out of this. So we believe that, to the point that Michael made earlier, some of the data is not available as easily today, and sometimes, quite frankly, the data you get from the outset does not necessarily always mirror up with what we see when we actually visit the company and look under the hood, right? So we believe our house score helps us on top of it to really make this assessment. But to the earlier point, this is a significant investment as a firm. It requires a quite diligent process. And to help these discussions, we have also launched last year here in the region the Asian Sustainability Institute, where we want to work on three elements. One is with the companies we invest, how can we help them to create better transparency on what information would help investors. Second is the investor education. So all the investors educate more what they can do when they invest and how to steer it. And the third one is also work definitely closer with regulators to align globally the requirements so that we have somewhat a consistent approach across the globe, which then will help all investors actually globally to be more confident that what they're investing into is ESG compliant.
Right. So let's just look at the bottom-up picture. How much pressure is there from your customers to be ESG or to sign up to stewardship or take stewardship forward or support ESG? Is there really pressure from your insurance policy holders, or in the case of your investment company, your investors? And is it a different story in Asia compared to Europe and the US? Dennis, what do you say?
Sure. Like what Renee was talking about a couple of weeks ago when we were having this lunch discussion, this was exactly the question he asked me.
Okay.
5 years ago, I think the conversations wouldn't be as robust as today. But today, just in Singapore, for Prudential Singapore, we have 5,000 agents. The 5,000 agents on a daily basis are facing these conversations because there are more and more of these conversations being asked and brought forth by the policyholders as well as members of the public. So it's because of that, that's why over the recent years, we have started to make sure that we train our people, and at the same time, make sure that available products are out there to meet these demands. So for example, ILPs that we have, right, are focused on ESG with an ESG theme. And when those products and solutions are being made available, there's just so much conversations literally on a daily basis. So to answer your question, I think, again, right, 10 years ago, I think we probably wouldn't have seen this, but now, and increasingly, and my personal belief is that this is going to continue. And we have definitely plans to beef this up, to make sure that we continue to meet the increasing demand by the not just the younger ones, right, but everyone. I think this awareness is really happening. And we as a company definitely want to make sure that we have sufficient information and well-trained advisors to be able to take these conversations with everyone.
Renee, from your investors, is there any pressure? Or do you need to really educate people?
No, I think, so just to share a few stats, European fund flows last year, 80% of flows were in ESG products. So in Europe, that train, unless you're compliant, you're actually going forward not going to sell your solutions going forward. I would think here in Asia, certainly on the institutional side, clients, everybody is looking on how to implement it. I think it becomes what you need to do. And I think the last point that Dennis mentioned, I think in the retail space, that's probably where a bit more education needs to be done and where we can all do a better job in explaining a bit better how they can also contribute to change with their investments.
Right. Terrific. I want to, before we end up, I think, I'm getting a signal here. I need to ask a question from the audience. How do you assess the leadership of the companies you're investing in as opposed to ESG? Tomorrow's company, we developed a stewardship scorecard. Do you have anything like that? So it's a question about the leadership. Maybe I could extend it a bit and say the culture of the company. You need a culture of integrity, you need a culture of customer satisfaction, or you need a culture of a culture of innovation maybe. So how do you assess leadership and culture in a company? I know it's not, these are not easily quantifiable, but what do you say?
I can give you the stat, and I think Dylan showed at the very beginning the Temasek value pyramid there, and that's exactly how we look at companies. Do the firms have a sustainability policy in place? How is it lived? What committees in the organization are part of this discussion? Is it outsourced, insourced? So we literally look at the whole value chain of governance, and then I think this is what I meant earlier before, right? If you go active looking under the hood, you will find actually very quickly whether the company is truly sustainable, focused or not.
Okay.
And if I may add, I think other than just research or paper-based research and all that, it's important for us to do the engagement. So what I like about is the SSP principles. If you look at it from the 2.0 principles now, I think it's principle number 3, right? For engagement, it's not just about engagement, it's purposeful engagement. So how do you have those purposeful engagement with the company? In those conversations, I think you can definitely assess and feel the texture a lot more.
Okay. Okay, a final question. I'll start with you, Michael, on this one. It's the different jurisdictions have different rules and principles on stewardship, and how do we achieve greater harmonization of investment stewardship? And
right.
Maybe what standards do you hold yourself up to?
So in, I guess, reviewing the Stewardship 2.0, the steering committee had a chance to look at the various developments within the region and globally, and we adopted the best practices that we've seen around the world, including integration of ESG into the principles, greater focus on governance within the asset managers, as well as going beyond just listed equities to other asset classes. Reporting was another key thing that we've enhanced, and this is really with a view to aligning ourselves with our global standards. So in answer to the question, I think already as a principle, that's where we aspire towards, and that's what is represented in the latest iteration.
Very good. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think we have run out of time, so I have to call it a day for this panel. Thank you very much for a most stimulating discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.